and signs the form of oath. Climax of the ceremony has arrived, when the Archbishop gently sets this splendid emblem on the Queen's head.
I think what has defined the Elizabethan era is it took us from the ravages of war to this extraordinary world in which we live in now. It actually defines the era of the greatest change the world has ever known. And yet, she managed to stay the same.
Her dedication and devotion as sovereign never wavered. Through times of change and progress, through times of joy and celebration, and through times of sadness and loss.
And I think the Elizabethan age defies that huge, huge change. And yet, there's still some things that remain the same. And one of them was this stoicism of the Queen and her sense of duty. And I think that sense of duty has probably died with the age.
In her life of service, we saw that abiding love of tradition, together with that fearless embrace of progress, which makes us great as nations. The affection, admiration, and respect she inspired became the hallmark of her reign.
The Queen's life is one of the most deeply and thoroughly documented and monitored. From her birth in London in 1926, to her wedding, her coronation, jubilee after jubilee, and her eventual death, there is little that is unseen of the Queen's life. By the time of her death, in 2022, aged 96, the Queen had witnessed enormous social and technological change. But there were numerous, very special moments which defined her life. Queen Elizabeth experienced a blissful childhood, enjoying country life with her mother, father, and sister. But the moment that would change everything was the difficult decision made by her uncle David, known as King Edward VIII.
At long last, I am able to say a few words of my own. I have never wanted to withhold anything.
On the 11th of September 1936, King Edward VIII broadcast to the nation that he would abdicate the throne to be with the woman he loved.
But until now, it has not been constitutionally possible for me to speak. And you must believe me when I tell you that I have found it impossible to carry the heavy burden of responsibility and to discharge my duties as king as I would wish to do without the help and support of the woman I love.
A moment that would not only change the life of Elizabeth's father, but it would change her life too. Elizabeth's sister, Princess Margaret, was quick to question what this would mean for her older sister and what the future would hold.
When their uncle, David as he was known to the family, otherwise King Edward VIII, abdicated, it was Princess Elizabeth who told Princess Margaret, and she said, "Uncle David's going away and Papa is to be king." And Princess Margaret said to her, "Does that mean you're going to be queen?" And Elizabeth said, "Yes, one day." And nothing more was ever said about it or between them. And Princess Elizabeth, as we know very well, is able to compartmentalize aspects of her life. So she realized, this girl of 10, that one day she would become queen.
Her relationship with her father, King George VI, was one of the most significant and important relationships in the young Elizabeth's life.
Princess Elizabeth was very close to her father, always was. I mean, he absolutely adored Margot, Princess Margaret, and Margaret made him laugh, but he was very proud of Elizabeth. And he saw that sense of duty. He spotted it very early on, and he knew that she would be just the sort of queen that the country needed.
Elizabeth's mother and father had many dogs whilst their 2 young children were growing up. But George noticed Elizabeth's fondness for the corgi. In 1944, on her 18th birthday, the king gave Elizabeth a Pembroke corgi, which she named Susan. The two became completely inseparable. And even when Elizabeth married Prince Philip, she hid Susan under the rugs in the open carriage as they travelled across London on their way to their honeymoon. She was so enamored with Susan, she began to breed corgis. In her lifetime, it's believed she owned over 30 corgis and dorgies, all but 2 of which were descended from her beloved Susan. Those corgis were lucky enough to listen to meetings with prime ministers, presidents, and state officials, as well as wander the Highlands beside the Queen, and enjoy a sleep by the fire at Sandringham during the traditional Christmas holidays. Most poignantly, during the state funeral following the death of Queen Elizabeth, as her coffin was taken back to Windsor, her 2 surviving corgis, Muick and Sandy, watched as the coffin passed by. Elizabeth's sense of duty started at a young age, and she was carefully schooled in the ways of the royal court and the traditions of formal occasions and etiquette. On her 16th birthday in 1942, she carried out her first royal engagement. During World War II Britain, she inspected soldiers of the Grenadier Guards. A potentially daunting first experience for some, but the young Elizabeth took it in her stride, a duty she would continue to undertake throughout her life. After years of death and destruction inflicted by the Second World War, Churchill announced the end of the war in Europe.
Hostilities will end officially at 1 minute after midnight tonight, Tuesday, the 8th of May. Today is Victory in Europe Day.
On the 8th of May 1945, the King and his family took to the balcony at Buckingham Palace. The crowds cheering, "We want the King." It was a time of very great celebration, following years of struggle through the turmoil. The young Princess Elizabeth later recalled what a special moment that was, and the thrill she and her younger sister Margaret had when they went and joined the crowds.
I remember the thrill and relief after the previous day's waiting for the Prime Minister's announcement of the end of the war in Europe. And my parents went out on the balcony in response to the huge crowds outside. I think we went on the balcony nearly every hour, 6 times.
It is well documented that the young princesses, disguised in army uniforms but accompanied by chaperones, went out into the London night, celebrating with crowds well into the small hours.
I remember we were terrified of being recognized, so I pulled my uniform cap well down over my eyes. After crossing Green Park, we stood outside and shouted, "We want the King." And we were successful in seeing my parents on the balcony, having cheated slightly because we sent a message into the house to say we were waiting outside. I think it was one of the most memorable nights of my life.
Following the end of the Second World War, the Windsors travelled to South Africa. It was Elizabeth's first official overseas visit, and no doubt an important moment for her father, the King, to show Elizabeth the importance of being seen as monarch. It was on her 21st birthday that Elizabeth made the speech she would forever be associated with. She pledged herself to the service of her people for the rest of her life.
I declare before you all that my whole life, whether it be long or short, shall be devoted to your service and to the service of our great imperial family to which we all belong. But I shall not have strength to carry out this resolution alone unless you join in it with me, as I now invite you to do. I know that your support will be unfailingly given. God help me to make good my vow, and God bless all of you who are willing to share in it.
Sombre and serious, Elizabeth presented herself as a capable young woman, ready for the crown, whenever that moment may come. For any couple, marriage is a pivotal point in their lives, and an important moment of commitment. It was no different for Queen Elizabeth, whose marriage to Prince Philip would last for 73 years. The wedding was a cause of great celebration. Life in post-war Britain was challenging. Austerity plagued the nation, and the idea of a royal wedding was a beacon of bright hope in the lives of the people.
When her engagement to Lieutenant Philip Mountbatten of the Royal Navy is announced, the heart of the world is thrilled by the prospect of one royal wedding with a genuine aura of romance. A former Greek prince, Philip gave up his Greek citizenship to become a British subject. On the eve of the wedding, the king elevates him to the peerage, and he becomes officially His Royal Highness Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh, Earl of Merioneth, and Baron Greenwich.
The wedding of Philip and Elizabeth was a light in the darkness, I think Churchill described it as, because it was 1947, just at the end of the war. And London was ravaged, you know, it was, people were, they'd come back from the army and they had no jobs. It was a really, really dark time. And the wedding of this sort of very handsome young couple did actually cheer the nation up. It really did. And it was in Westminster Abbey. It had everything that you would expect a beautiful wedding to have. With royalty from all over Europe, the first time they'd been able to wear their wonderful jewelry, which had been hidden away during the war. And it was magnificent, absolutely magnificent. And they all partied madly, and they just sort of thought, this is beautiful. This is a new Elizabethan age. This beautiful princess and her husband. Of course, nobody thought that she would become queen so quickly.
In the great Abbey of Westminster, Elizabeth married the man of her choice. The ceremonial drive reflected her happiness. For had she not declared as a young girl, "When I get married, I shall make my husband as happy as Mummy has made Papa." Before leaving on their honeymoon, the young lovers made a picture that found it treasured from the album.
The bride and bridegroom appeared before the cameras. The princess was now seen in the full splendor of that exquisite pearl-encrusted wedding gown, which has truly been described as something out of a fairy tale.
In an exquisite dress designed by Norman Hartnell, Elizabeth married her handsome naval officer in Westminster Abbey on the 20th of November 1947. It was one of the happiest days of the late Queen's life, and one she would recall fondly. The wedding was broadcast by BBC Radio to more than 200 million people worldwide.
The King, the Queen, and Queen Mary all reflected the joy of the occasion as they took their places in a memorable group.
The year after their marriage, Elizabeth and Philip became parents for the first time when Elizabeth gave birth to her first son, Prince Charles, on the 14th of November 1948.
The early years of marriage have set the seal on the happiness of the princess and her husband. The blessing of children has come not only to enrich their lives, but also to establish securely the line of succession. In Prince Charles, the public has acquired a new popular subject of interest, of whom some delightful pictures have been taken.
This, of course, was an exciting moment, not just for the family, but for the entire nation. After all, her son would, one day, become king.
It was in Kenya, at the Royal Hunting Lodge, that the news of the king's death reached his daughter. When she returned from a night in the forest, it was to learn that she is now the queen, acceding to her father's throne immediately. There is no break in the continuity of the British monarchy. It was her own decision to return at once to London.
Sadly, Elizabeth's father, King George VI, died at a relatively young age on the 6th of February 1952. The young Princess Elizabeth received the news in Kenya in the midst of a Commonwealth tour with her husband, Prince Philip.
When Princess Elizabeth received the news of the death of her father, she went into shock, as you would. I mean, she was shocked by his death because she thought he was getting better. Everybody within the family thought the king was getting better. He was at Sandringham, he'd been out shooting, he'd had a wonderful day, he was with friends, and as Princess Margaret said much later in an interview, he died just as he was getting well. But of course he wasn't really getting well, they thought he was, so it was a huge shock to her.
Upon receiving the news, the Queen was said to be stoic, and when asked what name she would wish to use as Queen, she replied, "My own name, of course, Elizabeth." Elizabeth had left the United Kingdom a princess, but she returned as Queen.
The rulers of our land meet to welcome the new queen. There too, the Duke of Gloucester, her uncle, and the Lord Chancellor. The Premier and Mr. Attlee, leader of the opposition, are agreed in this great moment of our history. Her tour of the Commonwealth cancelled. The princess we knew as a girl and watched in the even growth of her stature comes back to meet her ministers as queen over the great lands that for 15 years acknowledged her father as head. Now the Princess Elizabeth we knew and loved returns amongst us as our queen. Before her plane, her government and leaders of the other parties receive her greeting. No queen had ever such counsellors so predetermined to give of their best. No queen had ever such a people so devoted. Through the long years, she had grown amongst us, one of us. The little girl we knew has become Queen Elizabeth. The love we gave her has become allegiance. We knew her and we found her good, perhaps beyond our deserts. Then, as queen, she remembered those who had brought her swiftly and safely on her sad journey. She and her husband.
And it meant the end of her life as she knew it. She had 2 little children, a naval husband, and they just started out, really, on their married life. And they just moved into Clarence House, which was their first real home. And, you know, and he was going to be posted to Malta. Their life looked really rosy, and suddenly, basically, it ended.
The Queen's coronation was one of the most important moments of her life. Her dress, designed by Norman Hartnell, featured emblems from countries all around the Commonwealth. The preparation that went into the day was phenomenal. On the 2nd of June 1953, Queen Elizabeth II was crowned.
Well, the coronation of the Queen was a huge and very significant affair. It was a 3-hour ceremony. It was, everybody recalls, the coldest June day that had ever happened. And it was pouring with rain. And people, you know, there was, if you go back, this is 1953, so the army was enormous. And they had every sort of foot or 2 feet along the pavement, there was what they call streetliners, which were soldiers, and they were all really cold, and they were given sugar lumps infused with brandy to sort of keep them going. And the ceremony itself was very, very serious and very religious and very dramatic. And we'll never, well, not that we saw that, but no, we won't ever have a ceremony quite like that again.
In her solemn manner, she took the coronation oath and the crown was bestowed upon her head. A great moment in British history, as well as in her own life. In August 1957, a controversial article was published, written by John Grigg, also known as Lord Altrincham. It criticised the Queen, the way she spoke and looked, describing her as that of a priggish schoolgirl. Interestingly, Lord Altrincham was not a Republican. He was a monarchist. He believed in the power a strong and relevant monarchy could hold for the people, but felt the courtiers were wildly outdated and stuck in bygone times. Not what was needed for a modern young queen, and not what the people needed at the time.
Could I put one point to you? Aren't you falling yourself into the error of expecting the Queen to be endowed with superhuman powers, which is an attitude I'm sure you regret? I mean, to judge from your article, you expect the Queen to have qualities of a wit. You would like her to be a better orator. You would like her to be a TV personality, in addition to being a diligent, dutiful, and devoted monarch and a mother.
No, I would certainly be expecting a lot, and it would be expecting the impossible. Not that she may not have many of those qualities, but certainly it'd be impossible to expect people to have qualities they haven't got. What I'm suggesting is that in her public speeches and appearances, spontaneity should be the keynote. There are obviously certain speeches which have to be rather carefully prepared and which are of their very nature rather ceremonial. But I think that most of her speeches would greatly benefit from being more natural, from even if they're prepared, from seeming to be the sort of speech that she would make,
Aren't
and
you
not obviously made by somebody else and written for her by somebody else.
Of course, there is this problem that Her Majesty's speeches have to be bear in mind certain constitutional matters, and therefore they must be prepared by her constitutional advisors, who may be in Britain or Canada or anywhere all over the world.
Yeah, I quite agree, and that's what I was thinking of when I said there's a certain type of rather ceremonial speech, which obviously has to be rather carefully mulled over. But let's face it, I mean, there are masses of speeches of a more informal kind, or which should be of a more informal kind, which are at the moment made in a thoroughly formal way. And all I would like to see is the Queen's own character coming through. And I know that if her character is allowed to come through, the effect will be terrific. The effect at the moment is frankly not terrific, and that's not a criticism of her, that's a criticism of the way the thing is organised.
There was outrage at his criticism at the time. So much so, he even got slapped across the face. But Lord Altrincham persisted. He suggested multiple reforms to help the monarchy modernise and to become more relevant. The monarchy had to open up and be more visible, and one of his suggestions was that she broadcast her Christmas speech on television, which she went on to do in December 1957. A moment that changed how the next 64 Christmas messages would be shared.
Today is another landmark, because television has made it possible for many of you to see me in your homes on Christmas Day. I cannot lead you into battle. I do not give you laws or administer justice. But I can do something else. I can give you my heart and my devotion to these old islands and to all the peoples of our brotherhood of nations.
The Queen spent a great deal of time travelling and visiting other countries. She plays an important role in aiding Britain's diplomatic relationships. One of Her Majesty's memorable visits abroad was to the Federal Republic of Germany, known as West Germany, in 1965.
Queen Elizabeth's state visit to West Germany is turning into a personal triumph.
It was the first visit made by a British royal since 1913, and an attempt to help reconcile the countries following the war. She was received very well, and the visit helped to restore the relationships between the countries. It was one of the most historically significant visits she made in her 70-year reign. On the 21st of October 1966, there was a very deep sense of loss by the entire nation, when 166 children and 28 adults were killed in Aberfan in Wales, when the spoil tip of a coal mine slid down a hill and buried the children's school. Prince Philip, Lord Snowdon, and Prime Minister Harold Wilson visited Aberfan the following day. After 8 days, the Queen visited Aberfan, trying to find some way to offer some words of comfort in a small town, stunned by the enormity of the tragedy and their very own personal losses. Former Private Secretary, Lord Charteris, later revealed he felt he had given her poor advice, telling her to wait until the initial shock had worn off. It is said to be one of the few regrets the Queen had in her reign. The Queen had a special relationship with her prime ministers, but her first, Sir Winston Churchill, was known to be one of her favourites. Not only did he help her grow into her role as monarch, but the two were tremendously fond of one another, sharing in the same sense of humour.
Well, the Queen got on very well with her first Prime Minister, with Sir Winston Churchill, and they really used to laugh together. And of course they had the mutual love of horses and racing, so that was an immediate leveller. And I think that Churchill treated Elizabeth as a little bit of a sort of daughter to him, and he really, really tried to help her. But of course, in things like the Townsend situation, you know, he dug his heels in, but on the whole, he was very, very close to her, and they had a wonderful relationship. Probably, in fact, she says, it was the best relationship with any prime minister she's ever had.
Unfortunately, Winston Churchill died on the 24th of January 1965, aged 90. Protocol dictates the Queen should be the last person to arrive at any function, but the Queen chose to break with tradition on the occasion of his funeral, and she arrived before his family. They were then asked to join the Queen. This was an extraordinarily sad occasion for so many, including the Queen. The loss of a true statesman, a veritable and courageous war hero, and the most admired and revered leader of the time. Tens of thousands gathered and waited in line to pay their respects. Churchill was undoubtedly one of the most renowned political figures and leaders of all time. With such a reputation, it was clear that there was a great sense of mourning around the nation upon his death. It was decided that he would have a state funeral, a very rare occurrence, usually reserved for royalty and people of very great significance. Queen Elizabeth made royal history in 1970. Whilst on tour in Australia, she conducted the very first walkabout. Though common today, walkabouts were not part of royal life until the Queen started the tradition. Crowds might only catch a glimpse of the royals driving by. This completely changed the way royal engagements would be carried out, one of the many ways in which the Queen modernized the ways of doing things.
"1992 is not a year on which I shall look back with undiluted pleasure. In the words of one of my more sympathetic correspondents, it has turned out to be an annus horribilis. I suspect that I'm not alone in thinking it so. Indeed, I suspect that there are very few people or institutions unaffected by these last months of worldwide turmoil and uncertainty. This generosity and wholehearted kindness of the Corporation of the City to Prince Philip and me would be welcome at any time, but at this particular moment, in the aftermath of Friday's tragic fire at Windsor, it is especially so.
On the 20th of November 1992, a fire broke out in Windsor Castle. The Queen spent much of her time residing in Windsor, and it was well known to be one of her favourite residences. As the fire blazed, the Queen was spotted speaking with emergency workers outside. She was said to be terribly upset. The fire began in Queen Victoria's private chapel, quickly spreading to St. George's Hall. 225 firemen spent hours battling the flames. Unfortunately, the fateful event marked the end of the Queen's most unfortunate year, which she later referred to as her annus horribilis. Prince Philip chaired the Restoration Committee, working hard to restore 115 destroyed rooms. 5 years later, on the 20th of November 1997, the Queen and Prince Philip's 50th wedding anniversary, the restoration work was completed. This was a happy day for the Queen, celebrating the completion of the restoration of her beloved Windsor Castle, and 50 years with the man she loved. At a lunch held at Banqueting House in London, the Queen made a rare comment on her relationship with her husband.
Yesterday, I listened as Prince Philip spoke at the Guildhall, and I then proposed our host's health. Today, the roles are reversed. All too often, I fear Prince Philip has had to listen to me speaking. Frequently, we have discussed my intended speech beforehand, and as you will imagine, his views have been expressed in a forthright manner. He is someone who doesn't take easily to compliments, but he has quite simply been my strength and stay all these years. And I and his whole family, and this and many other countries, owe him a debt greater than he would ever claim, or we shall ever know. Prime Minister, thank you for helping us to celebrate a very special day in our lives.
One moment that few can forget was the death of Diana, Princess of Wales. On the 31st of August 1997, it was announced that Diana had died tragically in a car crash. The Queen was informed of her death whilst spending the summer at Balmoral Castle. At the time, the young princes, William and Harry, were with the family in Scotland, and the Queen, Prince Philip, and Prince Charles agreed it would be best to keep the boys at Balmoral whilst they dealt with the initial shock of what had happened. The British people, too, were in mourning, and there was growing unease and criticism of the Queen, fueled by the tabloid media, that Her Majesty was staying silent on the whole matter of Diana's death. Reacting quickly to the media furore, the Queen and the rest of the family travelled back to London, making a live speech from Buckingham Palace and offering her own touching tribute to Diana. It was a speech unlike any she had given before, and a real defining moment in her reign.
First, I want to pay tribute to Diana myself. She was an exceptional and gifted human being. In good times and bad, she never lost her capacity to smile and laugh, nor to inspire others with her warmth and kindness. I admired and respected her for her energy and commitment to others, and especially for her devotion to her two boys. I, for one, believe there are lessons to be drawn from her life and from the extraordinary and moving reaction to her death. I share in your determination to cherish her memory. I hope that tomorrow we can all, wherever we are, join in expressing our grief at Diana's loss and gratitude for her all-too-short life. It is a chance to show to the whole world the British nation united in grief and respect.
The Queen celebrated her Golden Jubilee year in 2002. However, the year did not start well. Princess Margaret died on the 9th of February 2002. To the Queen, this was a devastating loss. Quite unusually, on the day of Margaret's funeral, the Queen would be seen to wipe a tear from her eye. It is not often the Queen loses her composure and indicates the level of love and affection she felt for her sister. A month later, the Queen Mother would die, and Elizabeth gave a personal video message of her appreciation for the public mourning and love for the Queen Mother.
Over the years, I have met many people who have had to cope with family loss, sometimes in the most tragic of circumstances. So I count myself fortunate that my mother was blessed with a long and happy life. She had an infectious zest for living, and this remained with her until the very end. I know, too, that her faith was always a great strength to her. At the ceremony tomorrow, I hope that sadness will blend with a wider sense of thanksgiving, not just for her life, but for the times in which she lived. A century for this country and the Commonwealth, not without its trials and sorrows, but also one of extraordinary progress, full of examples of courage and service, as well as fun and laughter. This is what my mother would have understood, because it was the warmth and affection of people everywhere which inspired her resolve, dedication, and enthusiasm for life.
In 2011, Queen Elizabeth became the first British monarch to visit the Republic of Ireland. And during her visit, she spoke publicly about the troubles in the north.
Uachtaráin agus a coisa. Madam President, speaking here in Dublin Castle, it is impossible to ignore the weight of history. It is a sad and regrettable reality that through the history our islands have experienced more than their fair share of heartache, turbulence and loss.
The following year, the Queen shook hands with former IRA leader Martin McGuinness. A symbolic moment of forgiveness and reconciliation, which, for many, welcomed a new era of peace.
Good. Went really well.
Mr. McGuinness was delighted, but not a convert.
I'm still a Republican.
Martin, how was it to meet the Queen?
Very nice.
The role of a monarch is serious. Every day, the Queen would review the contents of her famous red box, take important meetings with prime ministers or diplomats, and attend engagements all around the country. But the Queen was known for her sense of humour, and occasionally the public have been treated to a small glimpse of that side of her. When the Olympics came to London in 2012, the Queen made a rather grand entrance. It was later revealed that the producers originally had not planned for her to speak. But the Queen insisted on saying those immortal words.
Good evening, Sir Bond.
Good evening, Your Majesty.
One of the Queen's great passions was horses. She loved to breed them and race them. Every year, they would be entered into all sorts of competitions.
I feel that, everybody knows that the Queen's greatest passion was racing and breeding. She was a complete expert on breeding racehorses, knew all the pedigrees, not just of her own horses, but of almost every other horse that was running. So she had an encyclopedic knowledge of racing, which was unsurpassed. I don't know this, but her trainers have said that she had this extraordinary knowledge and this wonderful interest. And, no one will be able to replace that. That was her main outlet. I mean, obviously she loved riding, but it was really racing. And riding was really a hobby for her. I mean, she never really rode competitively. She used to do a little bit of competitive carriage driving when the Windsor Horse Show very first started, but she wasn't a competitive rider, but she allowed her competitive spirit to come through in her racing and her breeding. And there was nothing more exciting to her than to see one of the horses that she'd bred win a race.
In 2013, her trusty horse Estimate won the Royal Ascot Gold Cup, the first reigning monarch to win the coveted prize in the 207-year history of the race.
Estimate has a neck in hand of Tiverton, a royal win in the Gold Cup. Estimate has done it.
And the Queen is watching her filly Estimate win the race for which she is meant to present the trophy. Her Majesty the Queen only presents 2 trophies during Royal Ascot, and look at the delight there, the sheer joy. Magnificent scenes, the crowd seeing that as well on the big screen and responding with laughter and with applause.
Queen Elizabeth was delighted when she saw Estimate pass the finish line. Her famous smile, ear to ear, and for a fleeting moment, away from her public duties, she was seen reveling in her greatest joy. Unfortunately, on the 9th of April 2021, Prince Philip, the Queen's dear husband of 73 years, died. He had always been her greatest support. Indeed, she described him as her strength and stay.
I'm sure that losing Philip was absolutely dreadful for her. Again, she's very stoic, and it's not as though it was unexpected. He'd been on a downward path for a few months, so she knew that he wasn't going to last forever. She also knew he didn't want to live to be 100, and she knew how stubborn he was. So I think she probably felt a bit of relief for him, because he was no longer in pain, and he'd gone very peacefully, and I think that was very important to her. And also, the Queen is extremely religious, and her faith would have held her together. I don't think there would have been an outpouring of tears. I think she just sort of withdrew into herself, which is what people of her kind of caliber do. She wouldn't have shown any great emotion, even to her children, I wouldn't imagine, but it would all be inside of her.
So his passing was a terrible loss to the Queen. Due to the COVID-19 restrictions, only 30 people were allowed to attend his funeral. In heart-wrenching images, the Queen was pictured alone wearing her face mask. A leader by example, she suffered that loss and followed the same rules as everyone else. In 2022, the Queen celebrated her Platinum Jubilee, marking her 70-year reign. The main celebrations spanned a long weekend, including the Trooping of the Colour and service of Thanksgiving.
The other thing that a lot of people don't know about the Queen is that at one time she wanted to be an actress. So forget Margaret being the great actress and singer. I mean, the Queen could sing, play the piano, and is a brilliant mimic. And she always rather fancied the idea of, well, I suppose in a way, being Queen, you are an actress. So when the Paddington Bear idea was mooted, she was thrilled to do it. And she was very professional because, I mean, there was just her acting against nothing. And they asked her, what kind of sandwich she'd like in her handbag. And she said, well, no, I don't want one with the crust cut off. I want a proper, big marmalade sandwich.
Perhaps you would like a marmalade sandwich. I always keep one for emergencies.
So do I. I keep mine in here. For later.
So it was wonderful, and she did it with great humour. And I think it really, really endeared her to the younger people, her young subjects, if you like, as well as her older subjects. And I understand that there were over 1,000 Paddington Bears left around and about London and all over the country in memory of the Queen, and they all went to Dr. Barnardo's homes.
Happy Jubilee, Ma'am. And thank you for everything.
That's very kind.
On the final day of the weekend celebration, towards the end of the Platinum Pageant, the royal standard appeared above Buckingham Palace. The flag flies to signal the sovereign is home. The crowds went wild with excitement and surprise. The Queen, accompanied by her closest family, stepped out onto the balcony. As the crowd sung the national anthem, it was clear this was an emotional moment for Her Majesty. Perhaps she knew it would be the last time she would stand on that balcony. The final moment that defined her life was her death. On the 8th of September 2022, Queen Elizabeth II died in Balmoral, Scotland. The extreme outpouring of grief was felt not just within the country, but around the world. It became clear her example of service and duty has been felt worldwide. She remains an icon of the times.
When it was finally announced that the Queen had died, there was an extraordinary outpouring of grief amongst the nation because, you know, the majority of the Queen's subjects had never known another monarch. And it was kind of the end of an era. It wasn't just her death, it was the end of an era. It was end of the Elizabethan age as we know it. And of course it was all so dramatic and so beautifully staged that made it even more poignant. The soldiers, the wonderful music, the people that used to work for the Queen, walking behind her coffin was very, very moving. And the crowd, we know, was crying. Or they were crying, or they were cheering, or they were just silent, completely silent. You could hear a pin drop. I remember when Diana died and the day of her funeral, you could just hear the birds. You couldn't hear anything else. No sound from the crowd. And that is a sort of real high emotion.
For if a jubilee becomes a moment to define an age, then for me we must speak of change, its breadth and accelerating pace over these years. Change has become a constant. Managing it has become an expanding discipline. The way we embrace it defines our future.
I think what has defined the Elizabethan era is it took us from the ravages of war to this extraordinary world in which we live in now. And so it actually defines the era of the greatest change the world has ever known. And yet, she managed to stay the same. On her 21st birthday, she dedicated her life to duty, and she certainly fulfilled that. I think she fulfilled it 1,000,000 times over, because that was her mantra. That and her religion, duty and God, held her together. That's how she managed to get through all these disasters and dramas and personal tragedies, was that she was very single-minded. And she made the pledge, and she really meant it. And it got her through life.
Queen Elizabeth was a life well lived, a promise with destiny kept, and she is mourned most deeply in her passing. That promise of lifelong service I renew to you all today. Alongside the personal grief that all my family are feeling, we also share with so many of you in the United Kingdom, in all the countries where the Queen was head of state. Thank you for your love and devotion to our family and to the family of nations you have served so diligently all these years. May flights of angels sing thee to thy rest.